The following program was produced by an independent community producer. The opinions expressed do not necessarily reflect those of the ECAT staff or board of directors.
I do want to give you a little bit of a history of graveyards and gravestones in Easton. We are in the Guinness Book of World Records for the most graveyards per square mile of any town in America, and it's hard to tell why. It was a big town back in the old days, 29 square miles, so there were a lot of family plots put in, and those family plots are all, of course, with the famous slate stones, which were the first stones to be used in New England, besides field stones. Our earliest cemetery is down on Church Street, and that was actually around the first meeting house. And that does have a field stone that was carved, but almost immediately anybody who had any money at all began to import stones from Boston and Charlestown, where there was a supply of good slate. And then later on, as civilization spread westward, slate was discovered in Attleboro, and a lot of the stones from the later part of the 18th century here were quarried in Attleboro and carved in Norton. There's a good book available at the Historical Society about this group of Norton carvers that have been neglected for a long time, because unlike the folks we all want to see, the folks that did the death's heads and all of that sort of stuff, these folks did acanthus leaf designs, and just didn't get the recognition, but they're getting it now. So that took us into the middle part of the 18th century, and then in the latter part of the 18th century, as civilization spread even further westward and got to Vermont, they discovered that Vermont had marble. And so marble had two associations. One, it was close by and pristine and beautifully white. And second of all, it was classical. And the first real period of American history was the federal period, when we, the new democracy, felt the kinship with the ancient Greeks and the Romans. So we wanted to be buried in a classical manner, and that can be actually seen right over here. If you have ever been to any of the big cities or Roman ruins, you understand that in the olden days the Romans buried people outside of their town along the road in urns. So we didn't want to do that. That was very un-Christian. So what we decided to do was take these beautiful pieces of marble, and this is clearly Vermont marble, it's very rough, and carve a urn on it. And then they also carved a willow tree design, willow, the weeping willows, symbol of mourning. So you get this willow and urn stuff beginning in the 1780s. This cemetery gets started in 1850, and this is the original cemetery. This 2-acre plot up front here was established in, I have this written down, September of 1850. And the first person to buy a plot was Dr. Caleb Swan, which we'll talk about at the end of the tour. And the first person to be buried here was this lady here. Now, one of the other attractive things about marble is that it was relatively easy to carve with the tools that people had available at the beginning of the 19th century. And so you could carve elaborate inscriptions or designs if you wanted to pay somebody to do that. And with her, it tells the sad story of the fact that she was away from Easton in Newtonville when her child was born, and both she and the infant son died there and were brought back and were the first people to be interned here. Okay. Now we're going to walk around, and most of the things I'm going to be talking about are people that were important in the 19th century and some of their stories. They were, to me, the middle part of the 19th century, around the time of the Civil War, is one of the most interesting times in American history. It's very similar to our own time. There was a big issue over immigration. There was a big issue over, of course, the issue of slavery. We have the issue of racism today. So a lot of the questions and problems that they had then keep cropping up in American history today. So it's kind of fun to look at the 19th century. And a lot of the things you see around town are associated with the people that we're going to be standing in front of and talking to. But before we do that, I want you to just take a long look in the cemetery. And basically, this is the first part of the cemetery, which is a little misleading because some of these stones here date from almost the turn of the 20th century, and they're still made out of marble. But what you do see here is a mix of marble stones, which I want to say right off the bat would have been, up until just a few years ago, completely black. But we had a wonderful man who just retired from doing this job called Ferris Bliss, who went around to most of the cemeteries in town and cleaned the marble under the auspices of the Cemetery Commission and the Historical Society. So this place looks a lot better than it used to, and it's a very, very well maintained cemetery. But in 1875, 32 acres were added to the back part of the cemetery, and then additional land has been added in back down there. They estimate that there may be there might be room for several hundred more graves, and they still have room to expand. So this is a very active cemetery, and we want to thank them for allowing us to be here today. This cemetery, started in 1850, marks a transition because there was an industrial revolution going on, and one of the things that occurred in the industrial revolution was the development of machine tools that could carve granite. And you can see here there's a mix of granite stones, and the gray granite usually indicates the older of the stones. I'll show you some other granite stones a little bit further in the past. There are some that are older that are not gray, but that's the basic style. So by the middle part of the 19th century, you could get a granite gravestone. And the reason for that, the reason that people took advantage of the technology, was they were already beginning to discover that marble was not a terribly permanent stone. The Industrial Revolution that gave us the Ames factory and a number of other factories in town also gave us the pollution that caused acid rain, which makes many marble stones eat away. We can see that as we go along. Let's go. Oh, I do want to remind you of one more thing, the folks at the cemetery. The grass here is really thick, and it's kind of bouncy, and it's also kind of lumpy, as are the roads. So we don't want to leave anybody here. Watch where you step, okay? Not that anybody's going to pop up and grab you. That's for the Halloween tour. So we're going to go over here into this corner. The first burial here was in 1850, but the dates that people are buried doesn't necessarily indicate when they first appeared here. There are a number of folks who died in 1847 or 1849 who are here, and the reason for that is this was a very prestigious place to be when it first opened. So a number of people moved their family here. One of the most important people who moved their family here was old Oliver Ames. This was the original Ames burying ground here in Easton, and they all moved, again, second time, up to the village cemetery in back of Unity Church, all except for one of old Oliver Ames's brothers, and we'll see him in a few minutes. This grave was here from the start, and this belongs to Colonel John Torrey, and you can see a couple of things here. First of all, this is what happens due to the bad weather. The original really smooth exterior has chipped away, and you end up with this, which then eventually falls off. Colonel John Torrey was mentioned last week on the tour that I took. He was the original owner of the house that now houses Walter's Barbershop up in North Easton, and he was a very prominent man in his time, and lost his wife, first wife, who is here. And shortly after, this is 1848, shortly after he married as his second wife, the niece of Evelina Gilmore Ames, the wife of Congressman Oakes Ames. So the cool thing about that house is that we know that Oakes and Evelina spent a lot of time there visiting her niece. We don't have that knowledge about many other places in Northeastern because those buildings have been torn down. The reason there's a flag here is not because he was Colonel John Torrey. Colonel John Torrey is a militia title. He never fought in a war. He did his volunteer work, and because he was an important guy, and there was deference to important guys, he was made a colonel. He died in 1864 during the Civil War, which confuses a lot of people. Oh, he must have died in the war. No, he died of insanity and dry gangrene, according to the medical. It wasn't a good way to go. At age 70. Now, the interesting thing about his death, he died in 1864. His son, Charles, died in Andersonville prison during the Civil War. He is not here, and there's no indication that he was here. So this isn't even a cenotaph, but his death was recognized by the original GAR post many, many years ago, and so every year he gets a flag, even though John Torrey wasn't the man who earned it. The obelisk is another indication of Americans' interest in the classical world. We all know obelisks come from Egypt, and another thing that makes people want to do this is that the Bunker Hill Memorial that was going up during this time was also an obelisk. So I could have one just like the Bunker Hill, except it's, you know, a lot shorter and doesn't have any stairs. All right, let's take the march. This is the grave of John Bisbee and his wife. John Bisbee is my favorite shovel worker. He was an early associate of Oliver Ames, and while old Oliver was making the shovel blades, John Bisbee was the man who was in charge of making the shovel handles. He didn't retire. He died at age 84, and he was still working into his 80s. So if you want to see what he looked like, go to the Y, and they have a picture on the inside of the folks outside the handle shop in 1871, which is the same year this guy died. And here he is. He's standing out there with a big hat. You can tell he's 30 or 40 or 50 years older than all the people that are standing around him. He's the good guy. And the coolest thing is, Reverend Chaffin had a very dry sense of humor, and when he wrote his History of Easton, he did make the comment that you know, be careful what you read in cemeteries, because so much of the engravings are monumental falsehoods, which means both big falsehoods and falsehoods they stuck on a monument. But he comments specifically about the caption that's here, which says, an honest man, the noblest work of God. And he says, no truer words were ever spoken. So this man was very popular, lived a long life in town. His daughter married the fellow that built the property where Bill's Pizza is today. So think of old John Bisbee when you contemplate retirement. Never retire. That's the thing. Okay. So far, what we've been looking at are the monuments made out of marble. And take a look as you go along. The folks that had money obviously spent more money on either an unusual shape, like those two that we just walked by, or unusual, and I shouldn't have done this, but this is what I discovered this morning. Come on over here. This is a very sad stone. Children's graves are always very sad. And this little girl, Helen, with two L's, died less than a year old. And clearly the parents were incredibly upset over that. So what they did is they hired somebody to carve a very elaborate gravestone that had a sculpture on the top, still has a sculpture on the top of a sleeping angel. It hasn't weathered very well in the acid rain, but there it is. You can still make out the figure. And what's also interesting is it has advertising on it. So you wonder whether you get a deal on a stone if you were willing to put an ad on it, because the carver, H. Johnson, has his name at the bottom of the stone. Well, this is not a Johnson grave, okay? So he was advertising. That's his carving. It's probably the only sculpture in town that I know of that's actually named by the carver. So that's something I didn't know until half an hour ago. But there it is. So if you have more money, you have more carving. We'll see when we get to the end of the tour and look at those almost 20th century graves. They're carved. This is carved. There's a 50-year difference. There's probably a difference in the quality of the stone. They could actually afford to have stone imported from Italy. But this poor little one is washing away. And then we're very, very happy to have Ferris come along and clean these up so that we can still appreciate them. So I was headed in this direction. So Joseph Barrows is the guy that built the house, what people in my generation would say is next to the high school. It's next to Doug King's apartment building, right on the corner of Barrow Street. That's his house. And if anybody here Irish? Yeah, you wouldn't have liked him. Okay, because he was the justice of the peace, but he also worked for the Ameses. And the Ameses were big into temperance. So he was the guy that the drunken Irishmen, when they appeared, would be hauled in front of and fined. Now, I have to say that in general, the Irish really weren't to blame, because the Ameses realized that the alcohol problem wasn't the fact that somebody wanted to drink. It's the fact that somebody wanted to sell to them illegally, because Massachusetts at some of this time was a dry state. So they did not just persecute the drunks that were hauled in, they tried to get the people that owned the places that were selling the liquor. So Barrows was a very, very well-respected person in his time. Obviously not fabulously wealthy, however. This is a beautiful stone and well carved. It's still kind of scratchy, so it's still, I would imagine, Vermont marble. But it's not excessively large, as we'll see in some of these other ones. Thanks for pointing that out. I would have walked right by him, and I wanted to talk about him. But I want to talk about this next guy, too, but this one's a little bit more of a mystery. So this is the grave of John Stevenson and his wife. And his son, not his wife. And again, you can see there's a nice piece of carving in there. That's an inlay kind of carving, very pretty. But John Stevenson has another. Oh, I should also point out, here's another ad. This one was done by Bryant and Company. So if you go back in a time machine, that's a place you want to deal with to get a headstone. But Stevenson was not a native of Easton. He came here to work in the shovel shops, and very, very shortly he built a house, or had somebody built a house. This is the mystery. Right on the corner of Park Street. It's that stone house right on the corner of Park Street, which you might have missed. But take a look at it. There was a quarry right up the street, a big quarry. We don't understand how big it is because it's all covered over with houses now. But it was a large quarry where most of the rock used in the shovel works and even some of the fancy buildings came out of, and the rockery. We think that Stevenson's house was an experiment. Most houses in Easton in those days and even today were made out of wood. Okay, this was one of the very first ones, and his house was built just a couple of years before Queeset House was built. There's a feeling that this house was built as an experiment and he got to live in it. And then after the experiment proved true, we could actually, build a house out of stone. They built Queeset and then went on from there. So it might have been a very important step forward in our town. It's a very simple gravestone. He's a shovel worker, so he was middle class by the time he died, after about 20 years living in town. So not bad. We're headed in this direction. So the quality of the stone could make a huge difference in how it weathered. This one was obviously a poor piece of granite, of marble, and it hasn't stood up very well, whereas the father in the family, Martin Randall, has done very well, except for the cracking. That's another thing that happens with the old slate stones, more so than even the marble stones. A little bit of a crack, the water gets in, it freezes, and the crack gets bigger and bigger until the stone falls over. Most of the stones that have fallen here, there's only one that I've seen in my travels this summer around here, have fallen down and not been put back up. Okay. The Randall family is one of the founding families of the town, and you could probably find a Randall in every cemetery in Easton. Okay. Family plots are interesting, but not everybody fits into the family plot, and some people don't fit in the family plot because they don't, they were the black sheep of the family.
So they don't fit the family?
Yeah, they don't fit the family, so they don't get to stay. But some people want to make sure you know how important they were, and that's our next gravestone. So this is the Thomas James gravestone. Thomas James, to the best of my knowledge, is the only person in Easton who was a soldier in the Mexican War. It wasn't very popular around here. And Mr. James was actually not a citizen of Easton when he went off and fought in the war in the 1840s. He lived until 1910. So he got a certificate for his service, and 50 years later he wanted you to remember that. And basically it says, know all whom it may concern, that Private Thomas M. James of Company D of the 3rd Regiment of Artillery, having distinguished himself in the service of the United States on the 13th day of July 1847 in the Battle of Calabozo, on the recommendation of Colonel W. Gates and commanding officer of the regiment, I do hereby award to said Private Thomas James the certificate of merit, which under the provisions of the 17th section of the act approved, blah, blah, blah. And then finally, given under my hand at the city of Washington on this 3rd day of May in the year of 1848 by James K. Polk, President. So somewhere there was a piece of paper that said all of this, but he knew that pieces of paper weren't reliable, so he had it carved on his gravestone. It's an amazing piece. That was expensive to have carved. Okay, and here he is bragging about it, and he apparently did do something. This is before we had the Medal of Honor, which we all know isn't an important medal because we've been told by former President Trump it's not as good as the Presidential Medal of Freedom, which all of us can still get if you do something spectacular or donate a lot of money to the Trump campaign, and he wins. But this was pretty cool. This apparently was the highest medal you could get for the time period. So one of these days I'm going to research this, but he wasn't really a townie. So I'm going to take some time before I do that. All right, we're gonna, let's see, are we gonna go up? Let me tell you, I actually have a route marked up. These people are very, I'm afraid they were going to move on me. So blah, 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 boop, boop. This is 12. Yeah, we're going to walk to the end because it never hurts to walk. Come on. If you've never seen one of these, this is a government issue gravestone. If you're a soldier, even today, and died, your family can write for the donation of a government standard gravestone. So you'll see these all over New England. They were extremely popular during the Civil War. There's one here, there's one in the oldest cemetery of Easton, and basically it says the person's name, the company, and the regiment that the person was in. And he was a Easton resident at the time, so and he gets his flag. So he saved a lot of money. You know, he got this from the government, didn't spend any money to have it carved. But which gravestone are you going to remember? That one or this one? I suppose. If you're going to build a pyramid, build a big pyramid.
My relative, I'd remember that.
Yeah. Well, he's not my relative, and neither is he. But that one I remember. Yes. You have a question?
No.
Okay.
Well, probably, but.
Well, just feel free to speak out. If you see some.
It's awesome.
Yeah, if you see a person that you want to know about, I can always take a guess. Okay. And if I'm really pressed to the wall, I can just lie.
But these stones don't have death date on them, do they?
They don't, but there is a record. There's a card that you can fill out, which is available at Ancestry.com, that gives you that information. Because you have to apply for it. The White family has had an interesting history in Easton. The great horse thief of Easton, George White, was a White, and then in Chaffin's time nobody wanted to claim him as a relative. So although Chaffin was very nice and saying, yeah, you know, he's got living relatives in town, but we're not going to say anything. But then he leaves all these clues for me to follow 100 years later. So yeah, Ed White, who used to run the Simpson Spring, was a descendant of the horse thief. And a number of people that are buried here, Alonson White, if you happen to see his gravestone, it's over there, was like the grandson of the horse thief.
You can't do anything about your relatives.
Yeah, you can't do anything about your relatives other than not give them a gravestone. So, I did mention the fact that today you have a lot more choice in gravestone, and this is one of the more active areas over here. And two things I do want to point out: the dark black solid gravestones. Those two are granite, but they don't show the grain pattern. And the other thing is that right now there's a huge trend towards etching gravestones. So you do a black gravestone or seal it black on the outside and then do an etching, and that may or may not last. We don't know. The other thing that you can do is you can actually have a portrait put in now too, an inlay portrait, which some people have told me that they tried to do back in the 19th century, but of course the portraits didn't last for very long. Those are supposed to last. So this is a newer section of the cemetery, and I guess the reason I brought you down here is we needed to do this way, and I'm a little reluctant to walk over all the folks. But I do want to point out that in this corner, which we're not going to go to, is another cemetery. There was a cemetery on Pine Street that they needed to put in some new housing, and there were only half a dozen graves, so they just dug everybody up and moved them up here.
And that was recent?
Almost within living memory. Yeah.
Okay, within living memory.
Yeah.
So not.
What?
So not recent.
No.
In the last decade.
No, not in the last decade. No, it's more like back during the Depression, maybe a little bit before. So this is a Davis stone. The Davises have been a family in town for a number of years, and then one of their members was a sergeant in the Civil War in the 26th Mass Volunteers, veteran volunteers, and he was captured like the boy up above that we talked about, the Colonel Torrey's son. But he went to Salisbury Prison, which was sort of the Club Med of rebel prisons. There were three that are very, very famous. One is Andersonville. They didn't have enough food, and in the summer of 1864, people starved to death. The commandant was relatively cruel, although his granddaughter says, no, that's all made up. I taught with her for a while. And he wasn't as cruel. It was all about the food shortage. And then there was Libby Prison. Libby Prison was in Richmond, and it was in a big building. It was a real prison that we'd recognize, not a prison camp. And because it was so crowded and indoors, there was a lot of health problems. George Cogsill, who has his picture up on the wall at the Historical Society, went in there voluntarily in order to treat the Union soldiers, and he actually got a few out. He lied them out. Yep, if you keep him here, he's going to die. And there's one thing about armies. If you say, he's going to die on your watch, they always send you home to die. The other, we'll see that in a minute too. But Sergeant Davis went to Salisbury Prison, which was in North Carolina, there was a fair amount of space, and it was the least bad of all the prisons. But he contracted some kind of a disease, was exchanged right towards the end of the war in March, got as far as Annapolis, Maryland on the way home, and died. And the interesting question with these boys who died far away is, are they here or are they not here? And we don't know. This could be a cenotaph, or it could be an actual gravestone with George buried here, actually, I guess. He's supposed to be facing east, so he should be on the other side. Okay. We're not stepping on him here. All right. And again, we're still looking at marble stones. Now we're going to be headed into some alternative stones, including one of my favorites. You do.
What's the
That's a shiny marker. And you're bending over. I don't do that anymore. What does it say?
it says American.
Yeah, I could see that. What's the small print say? And the smaller print.
Let us.
It looks like a veteran symbol.
Yeah, it is a veteran symbol. That's exactly what it is, and it's a shiny veteran symbol. And the idea here is these flags are supposed to be replaced annually.
But I saw that on like another one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Many of them have these stickers on them to remind people this is where a flag is, because, you know, hey, I'm a kid. I'd like
Well, it might get snow, and that might be covered up.
Yeah, or it's made out of brass and somebody stole it to make it melt it down. That's happened. And the flags get taken. So, by the way, this cemetery has more American flags, more veterans' graves than any cemetery in Easton. So, and it's a good memorial to our veterans that every year around Memorial Day they come and replace all the flags, and that's a damn lot of flags. Okay, we're dealing with a guy over in France right now. One of our boys, Robert Hagland, died in his village towards the end of World War II, and they put flowers on his grave. And this guy, he's me over there in France, wants to put together a display for the school kids to tell them who this young man was. So we've been doing all sorts of research. He's buried in France. The family grave is over there, and either this block or the next one. Now, it took me forever to find it. And it basically says, you know, killed in action and then buried in France. So what that is a cenotaph. It's a memorial to people who died that aren't there. Okay? So we do have one of them here. Oh, this might be another. All right. Onward. This is the Simpson grave area, and I believe that this is the Simpson that Simpson Spring is named after. It's George, I believe. So that one I didn't research as much as I should. All the names we've looked at so far have been Yankees, and no Irish, and no Swedes. You don't get until the 20th century anybody who is Catholic, because we have a Catholic cemetery, and while this is at least now a non-sectarian cemetery, most Catholics that were buried in Easton preferred to be buried in the Catholic cemetery, which is now running out of space. The other thing is the Swedes were Protestant, so there was no problem with being buried in a cemetery like this, even if it was non-sectarian. But they weren't for a long time. And this is a very early version of a Swedish person, Mary Eriksson, clearly Swedish, who was buried here in 1903. That didn't mean that she was the first Swedish person to die in Easton, but most of the early Swedish graves are across the street in the Seth Pratt Cemetery. There was still space available over there. It was less expensive than here to be buried there, and many of them are buried over there. But if you get over into this part of the cemetery, it's mostly all Swedish now. Okay, so there's a lot of, you can see a Swanson, you can see a Lund.
Were they related to the Pratts?
No.
There? Okay, because when I wandered through there, I assumed they were somehow related, even, like somebody married. Okay.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. There were private cemeteries. This is a private cemetery. In other words, you have to pay to get in, but. There are some cemeteries, the cemetery on Church Street, the cemetery on Pine Street, not Pine Street, Morse Avenue, I guess it's called, the Pine Grove Cemetery that belongs to the town. So if you want to get buried there, you deal with the town, not a private cemetery group. And then there are still some family cemeteries. The Pine Grove Cemetery was a family cemetery up until just a few years ago when the town bought it. We need graves for people who can't afford to be buried in a nice place like this. Not that Pine Grove Cemetery isn't beautiful. It's one of my favorites. It's much shadier than this. And this is a beautiful cemetery. But that's spectacularly pretty as well. And has older stones. So as a historian, I like the older stones. But that was a private cemetery until the folks that were running it, the Hayward family, just felt it was getting too expensive to have it mowed, and they sold out to the town. We got about 100 graves that way, which alleviates the need for burial space.
Where's Pine Grove?
Pine Grove is, I guess the best way to say it is it's across the street from the regional school. It's actually just down the road a little bit.
Okay.
There's that little side road that goes off. It's in there.
Right.
That's a fun one to go and visit. That's the one where great-grandfather dies, and it lists he died and he had 5 children and 10 grandchildren and 95 great-grandchildren, and the wife dies a few years later. Yep, I can top that one. I have 105 great-grandchildren. It's really funny. It's very cute. Yeah, that's there. Do we have a potter's field? Do you know what a potter's field is?
Poor people that don't have markers.
Yeah, indigent people that die and you don't know who they are, or this, that, or the other. The last pauper to be buried here was a baby that was found tossed over a wall at Stonehill College. And Lou Silva, who worked for Stonehill College, wanted to do so. He researched it, and we do have a potter's field. It's at the Church Street Cemetery, and there's a little corner where there's a stone post, etc., etc. So she's buried there, and I guess there are a couple of adults that made it there as well, but very sad. We don't have one here. When I was teaching in Randolph, the Central Cemetery in Randolph has a potter's field. Usually it's not in the best place, and when I was there, the potters started to wash up the back of the cemetery. So luckily something was done. Two things were done. Here's a bad cemetery story for you. The teenagers discovered that you could make pipes out of people's finger bones to smoke your marijuana with. So some of that stuff appeared, and then finally the town took action and reburied all the people that were washing out. So yeah, there's a lot of good cemetery stories. Just to tell you a fun one, There was a burial in the new section over here just recently, and Joe Hurley, who digs the holes and is on the cemetery board, said, "Yep, we dug the hole and came back the next morning to make sure everything was all right, and there was a skunk in the bottom of the grave."
Oh.
So there's this long story about how they got the skunk out. The skunk wasn't hurt, but it took them a while to get him out of the grave, and he only squirted a little, so it wasn't too bad. Anyway, let's continue. Let's go right over here. Does anybody want to tell me what this is made out of?
Some metal?
Yeah, some metal. Come on, you can't get any points for some metal.
Well, I could. Aluminum? No.
That's not a bad guess. It's actually made out of zinc, which for some reason became very, very popular for a very short time, just around this time. And this is the grave of Lucien Bonney, who was a fairly wealthy man in town, but what was important was his wife and his wife's twin sister, Clarissa and Emily. So dear old dad, who lived in the house that's on the old house that's on the edge of Eisenhower Drive up here, was at a point where he was going to lose the whole farm because he was broke. And Clarissa and Emily were really good singers, and in the 1840s, I think it's the whole. Why am I saying this? The story's on the back. Come around. This is another one where Lucien, who survived, told his wife's story. So Clarissa and Emily were the daughters of David and Phoebe of Easton. When business misfortune threatened their father with the loss of the heavily mortgaged homestead and with financial ruin, the daughters, then 22 years old, came to the rescue. This is true. Gifted with remarkable voice and musical talent, with violin and violoncello, they started out alone on the hazardous experiment of a concert tour, singing first at Winthrop, Maine, then traversing all of New England with a business manager. And there's, if you want to look up the story, the business manager was a little skanky and, you know, blah, blah, blah. So this was at a time when women performers were looked down on, and these girls said, to hell with being looked down on, we're going to go and raise the money, and they did well. And they had ill fortune and sometimes striking adventure. After 45 years of incessant effort, they had the joy of lifting the mortgage from the homestead and giving their parents a comfortable home for their life. Well may Easton honor their children, emulate, and may Easton honor and her children emulate the noble example of the filial devotion of this. So when I think it was Clarissa died, her husband, Lucien Bonney, put up this monument, and it just shows you what this was cast in zinc, and it's pretty amazing, and it's been here since 1897. And it's still in almost perfect condition. So this might have been the way to go, but the fad didn't last very long. There's only a few of these in town. There's one in the Pine Grove Cemetery that we were just talking about. But they're beautiful, and this one has a great story. Phoebe and what's the dad's name? David are over here. We're gonna go visit them as we look at the important people. The important people are right here. My favorite. Here's my favorite dead person right here. You can see Barzilla Dean. Yeah, it is a great name. He lived in the house. I think he actually built the house on the corner of Depot and Washington Street, across the street from the car wash. Okay, and so it's a beautiful house. Clearly he was a wealthy man. His son J.O. Dean became J.O. Dean Feeding Grain. He's on the other side of this marker. But Barzilli decided to have a family plot just up the street from his house. The cemetery is actually still there today. It's on Depot Street as you head back towards Five Corners, and so he was digging a grave that was going to have a stone thingamajig over the top of it. What were they called those? Anyway, it wasn't a gravestone. It was going to be a tomb. And he was digging, and the stone fell in on him and killed him. So, irony of ironies, the family buried him there. And when they got a little bit rich and came back a few years later, after about 15 years, they brought him down here. So he's buried here, not under the stone that squished him, but here he is. The Dean family is telling you, man, they had money, because this is a richly carved granite memorial. It must have cost a fortune. Okay. Plus, they built a wall around the family plot, which meant that only a certain number of deans could make it inside here, and there are deans scattered in other parts of the cemetery. But this is the family of J.O. Dean and Thomas Dean, who had the factory and feed and grain store where the car wash is now. Okay. Here, this is the gentleman we need to thank, Palmer Newton. Palmer Newton probably, he was a Yankee. He probably swung a deal where, you know, if you give me a space to put up this obelisk, I will give you 32 acres of land. And that's the basic part of the cemetery back here. They started off with 2 acres, and 25 years later, they added this 32 acres that goes back into the woods here. This person here, Elijah Howard, was probably the richest man of all of the people that are buried in this area. If you were looking for a rival of Oliver Ames in the early days of the 19th century, it would have been Elijah Howard. Elijah Howard did a lot of experiments trying to perfect the manufacture of cotton and cotton thread. So he had factories at the what's called the Red Mill site, which is the low spot in Main Street across from sheep pasture. He had space down at what became the J.O. Dean grist mill. It didn't become; it was already a grist mill. J.O. Dean bought it eventually. Anyway, so Elijah Howard was a very rich man, and he was also very civic-minded. He served as town moderator for many, many years, and did a lot of good services for the town. And Chaffin, in his 1886 History of Easton, has a picture of him in there, and there are very few pictures in Chaffin's book, if you've ever tried to read it. So it was him and the Ames boys and Olive Reed, who is the most neglected of all the big time people. She's the person whose house we're letting fall down across the street from the Civil War Memorial. So, which is a real sad story, because she was a pioneering feminist and also an anti-slavery crusader. So. It's sad that the town doesn't see fit to be aggressive in trying to save that building, which has now probably gone too far to save. All right, we're going to head in this direction. Morses are a very famous family in town, and they planned well. They have a lot of folks buried in the family plot here. This is the original plot of Edward J.W. Morse. Edward J.W. Morse came to town in the 1830s and established a thread-making empire. And if you're a person who's ever sewed anything or picked up stuff that your mother has dropped, you know that the Morse factory was the original home of silkatine thread, which is still the best thread that's available, because it's made out of long fiber cotton, which was only available in the Sea Islands off the coast of South Carolina. So every year Edward Morse would go down there and try to beat the English, who got most of it, to a supply of this thread. His mill was just down the street in back of Hennessy's Liquor, and they became really wealthy. If you were picking if you were picking somebody who wasn't in Ames to be the richest person in town, these guys were close for a long time, hence the ability to afford a sculpture. Now let's take a look, see if anybody has a name on this. You can see that the marble is starting to pebble, and up until Ferris came along, this was completely black. She looked like this. If you made your money in the 1850s and 1860s making thread from cotton made down south, maybe there was a reason this one turned black. And we don't know how he felt about the slavery issue, because his next door neighbor down the street was the leading abolitionist in town, which we'll visit in a few minutes. But this is the biggest and most impressive sculpture in a cemetery in Easton, except for there's a bronze sculpture for one of the Ameses in the village cemetery, and then there's the metal box that Blanche made, which wasn't zinc, it's actually copper or bronze, which she carved, but that's Blanche. She could do things like that. Probably whipped it off in a weekend. But it's a pretty damn good sculpture. And the Morse family remained important for a long time. The grandson of the founder was the person who built the Morse car. And if you don't know what the Morse car is, we have one of the two at the Easton Historical Society. We have the prototype model, and then somewhere out in the world, in a museum someplace, is the production model that is 4 years older, 4 years young. Excuse me, 4 years younger. All right. Does anybody have any questions on this? Notice how it's raised up above everybody else too. They were really putting on airs. Yeah.
That is impressive.
What?
That is impressive that's a fair amount of soil to bring in to raise us up.
Yes, yeah. Yeah, that's true.
Do we have a place where there's Native Americans or people of color?
We have a cemetery that includes people of color. I'm doing a multi-year study of people of color in southeastern Massachusetts area, and there was surprising lack of people of color. We had in 1850 or 1860 7 or 8 people in our town. Okay. And they're all buried in the cemetery on Prospect Street, almost down to Bay Road on the left-hand side, where Emma Griggs is also buried. Emma Griggs is famous because all the people in that particular part of town says, yeah, see the sad gravestone? It says, peace, peace, peace. Bury me under the murmuring pines. It will save it will soothe my troubled soul. And all the people in the neighborhood, all the old timers swore she was the mistress of one of the Ameses, which is why she has a troubled soul. So she's there, and then we had essentially 2 families, the Cordners and the Mannings, and they were intermarried with each other, and they're all there. And I'm sure somebody is going, oh, it's a segregated cemetery. Look, all the black people are buried together, which, number one, is not true. Most of the black people are buried together. And second of all, most people are buried with their family, and so are they. So it's a typical New England cemetery. Good gravestones. They were slate, so they're less likely to fall apart than these marble ones.
Where is that again? Prospect Street?
Prospect Street, yep. There's 2 cemeteries, the Colonel John Williams Cemetery and the Lieutenant John Williams Cemetery.
Colonel and Lieutenant. Okay.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. So
your rank here.
Yeah, so they're both worth visiting, but the one with the people of color is on. If you're headed towards Bay Road on Prospect, it's on the left-hand side. Down in the corner. Well worth a trip. So we're almost done. Hang with me. Depends on how much more you want to walk, I guess. I do want to show you this one here. This is a how do I say it? A fun grave. This one, what a pain in the neck this guy was. So this is Charles Albert, son of Charles and Vesta Morse. He's part of the Morse family, okay? And he was a sergeant, just like the gentleman we visited down below. He died at Falmouth, Virginia. There was a battle at Falmouth, Virginia, and he died in 1863. And he should be on our Civil War memorial. So I thought. So I did the research. I looked in Chaffin. He's not there. Chaffin did a real good job of listing all the soldiers, but they had standards back then. So the fact that he's living here now permanently doesn't count. Okay? What counts is you had to be alive and serving before you died in order to get in the book and also to get on a memorial. He was a Morse. The Morses were from actually out of town. They came here in the 1830s. His family didn't come. He was living in Mansfield or Foxborough when the war started. And so they get credit for him, not us. So you can't research him as easily as you can the other guys. But Miss Vesta is a wonderful name from the old days. And somebody that made it to be a sergeant was certainly an important person. And again, very similar to the stone we just saw with the shield carved in it. Just want to finish the story that started over there with the zinc memorial. This is David and Phoebe, the parents of the two girls that saved the family farm. So when they died in the 1860s, they had enough money to make this marble marker. I think that the granite piece underneath was added later. Okay, but what I really wanted to show you is this. This is in memory of their brother or nephew, I can never tell which, nephew, son of Benjamin and Mary Macomb, who was drowned by breaking through the ice on the 9th of December, 1836, age 9 years old. So again, we have a children's grave. This is his father over here. This is the thing of the boy. Obviously, they spent more money on the gravestone for the little boy that was lost. So it just shows in the 19th century how the people were so solicitous and sad about the deaths of children, which happened all the time. I mean, if you made it to 10 years old in this time period, you were doing well and could live as long as we do today. You know, when you see that the average age of death was 40 years, yeah, these damn kids were pulling down the average.
The average down.
Yeah. So again, it's a beautiful sculpture. We don't know who did it, but they did a nice job, and it's lasted a while. You know, it's not going to be as good as the carvings in ancient Egypt, but it's going to outlive us. So if you're not a native, you may not know about the fight between good and evil, or North and South Easton, as we say.
Which one's evil?
North Easton. People in South Easton go out of their way to say, yeah, you know, you guys have this and we don't have that. So this is one of those, we don't have that, now we're going to have this. So I'm sure the folks that dedicated this are hoping that one of the big ceremonies, either Veterans Day or Memorial Day, will come here for part of the ceremony. This is their Veterans Park. You have the guys that are sculptured in the different uniforms. They look older than this area, so I don't know what the story is. I'll have to ask. They may have come from another part of a cemetery or another cemetery, but it's nice to have them here and have the flag. And clearly, if a veteran is buried here, this would be the focal point of the ceremony. And this over here is a columbarium. Is that what they call that? It's a place where they stuff urns.
Columbine.
No, Columbine's a place in Colorado. So.
No, I think that's how you
Say it again?
Columbine?
Okay. It's where it's
Columbarium.
Columbarium, you got it, yes.
Okay.
A winner, we have a winner.
Then, okay, give me the spelling. And
Yeah, there's more syllables than you originally had, but you got it now.
It's like up here, most people are buried in a casket,
Yes.
where in Florida, they're buried, most are cremated.
Yes. Yes. And this is where people that are cremated are placed now. So it's a new offering of the.
It's an option.
Yeah. It's either that or they scrunch you up really small, and if you're an archaeologist, you know they do that. It's called a flex burial. But whoa, huh? That's the son of somebody I actually taught with in Randolph. I don't what the heck is he doing over here? But this is lovely. They obviously take the brass screws out, take the plaque down, and do the placement. A wonderful idea. This particular cemetery is really on the ball. They really are trying to be as modern and as helpful as possible. If I was going to be buried in Easton, this is where I'd be buried. But thankfully, I'm not going to be buried here, so anytime soon, or ever. All right, well, now we're gonna swing wide and go across and see the Lee Williams gravestone for two reasons. Number one, it's a fun gravestone, and number two, Lee would be pissed if we didn't show off the gravestone. This is Lee Williams's gravestone, and he died in 2021 after a long career in philanthropy and sarcasm. He was just a fun person to be around, and he knew, for instance, he wasn't going to make it to the tricentennial celebration, so he left a substantial sum of money so that the celebration would definitely go ahead. He also, whenever he volunteered for so many organizations that he has the stamps of many of them on it. And this is that new engraving that we were talking about. You can't even feel that that's been engraved in. That will last for as long as the outside stone lasts. And so he was a Melvin Jones Fellow, which is the highest award you can get as a Lion. He was a member of the JCs, and when the JCs broke up, he managed to divide and invest their money so that it's still donating to charity today. And then on the other side, his favorite place to go was the Gurnet, where he had a summer home. So there's the Gurnet Lighthouse there. There's the Society of Mayflower Descendants. He was a genealogist. He didn't do a lot of the research himself. It was important to him to have the professionals do it. But he's a member of the Mayflower Society. And then his last big donation while he was alive was the Main Street clock. So they're all here. And despite the fact that he stole it, he has probably the best quote of any gravestone in Easton.
I told you I was sick.
And just recently, money that he left to the cemetery was used to buy these trees that are over here. So Lee was quite a character. We all miss him. The cemetery, the funeral was held here, and there were at least a couple of hundred people here. The whole area that we're standing in now was just surrounded by people. And he had a regular funeral, he had a military funeral, he had, I think the Grange did their funeral, so it was a long ceremony, but we all miss him. All right, we're going to finish the tour by looking at a couple of people that shouldn't be missed. This is the only member of the direct Ames family. Did we lose somebody? Somebody just drove through. Okay. I was just, it'd be a great story. I lost 30% of the tour. It was amazing. Yeah. It's not as bad as we did a tour of Center Street in 105-degree heat. And despite the fact we stopped at Little Peach to hydrate, by the time I got done, we had gone from 20 to 5. So this is John Ames. Oliver Ames came from a large family. He was born in 1779, the last son of Captain John Ames of West Bridgewater. And this was the brother that was born closest to him. And for some reason, when they dug up the family, which was planted in this area, he didn't get moved. But what eventually happened was, whatever stone was here, which I don't think was this one, was replaced with this modern granite stone. The style here it reeks of 20th century. So there's a mystery here. I asked Bill Ames, what's the story? And he says nobody in the family knows now what went on. And Bill's usually pretty good at telling me what's going on. Other than the fact that perhaps when he died in 1840 something, he couldn't have been buried here because the plots didn't open up until another 4 years. So it's a mystery. It's an Ames family mystery. There's some room, I shouldn't say plenty, there's plenty of, I said it again, there's some room up there to bury more Ameses on Village Cemetery on Ames Hill. They have a hill, Ames Hill. It's right in back of Unity Church. And so if you'd like to do a tour of Unity Church, let me know. Oh, you can't. We have to replace a window, so I'm not sure we'll be doing any tours. A big window, like a $500,000 window, unfortunately. And before we go back and finish with the last group, I want to point out this obelisk over here. You can see this is the Williams family, not related to Lee. This is the Williams family. And the original Milo Williams and his brother Leonard came to Easton from Stoughton and bought most of the land that's now sheep pasture. So that in itself is a nice thing. Thank God they did, because it would have all been chopped up into little house lots. Captain Milo, his son, was our very first captain of the militia company that went out at the start of the Civil War. We believe he gets some kind of a disease, doesn't do well for the next couple of years after he returns to Easton, and dies in 1863. He gets a Veterans Memorial marker, but he's not listed on the monument in Easton because he was out of the service when he died. Okay. Someone who didn't die, but probably at times wished he had, was Monroe Williams. Monroe was an interesting character. When he was younger, he left Easton to seek his fortune and couldn't find it. So he ducked out on his landlady in Worcester, I think it was. And unfortunately, because it was a slow news year, it made the papers back here. So everybody laughed at him. Oh, here he is. What a scamp. He ran out on an old landlady. But he enlisted in the war and ended up at the Battle of Fredericksburg, where he was seriously wounded. And it was a horrible battle. Not that all of the Civil War battles weren't horrible, but this one was really horrible because the rebels counterattacked, and the aid station where he was being treated was about to be overrun. And they dragged the worst people away in stretchers. He wasn't quite the worst people. He had to drag himself away. So he's dragging himself on the ground. All the dirt and stuff got in his wounds. He did make it to a hospital, but it took him months and months to recover. His unit wrote a book many years later. There's a sketch of him, and he has these haunted eyes. You can just tell that he ended up with PTSD. He didn't get married until very late in life, and he came back, and William Street, which you all know, was named for him and his family. That derelict house that's there now was part of the family ownership plot. He had a small photography studio. He's the first person in Easton's history that we know as that was a photographer. And that's his story, a real hero. Okay, so it's someone who turned his life around, came home, and lived on for many years. He died in 1901, which was not excessively late for Civil War people. All right, the last headstones. But you got to hear this story. These people were important. This is Caleb Swan. He was the guy that bought the first 2 acres for the cemetery in 1850, thinking ahead. He didn't die until 1870. And he was the #1 abolitionist in Easton. Not only did he fight to end slavery, in local activities, but he was a figure that was well known all across the state. He ran for statewide office as an abolitionist. He ran all sorts of meetings. He worked really hard. And we know that he was involved in the Underground Railroad, whatever that was. We know now that the Underground Railroad was not like the tea at rush hour. There weren't, 10,000 people coming through Easton every year trying to escape slavery. But when they did, they would know Caleb Swan. Okay, and the reason we know that is that his son, who was also a doctor, was also involved, and that's the last stop. We're going to go over to his grave here. So again, the more carving that you have in a gravestone, obviously, the more costly it was. So these were expensive gravestones, mostly from the very last part of the 19th century. So these very well could have been in granite, but they chose to use marble instead. And the stone I want to point out to you is this one over here. This is James Swan. Luckily for him, he died in the 1890s. Unlike Josiah Keith, who died in 1803, and Josiah ended up owing money to everybody in town, which didn't make him real popular. But James was a very popular doctor in West Bridgewater for many, many years. And like his father, he was involved in this abolition movement and the Underground Railroad. And we know that for sure because a family came through West Bridgewater, probably on the way to Boston up our Washington Street, and got stranded in West Bridgewater. One of the kids, named Lily, had tuberculosis and she was very sick. She couldn't go on. The rest of the family moved on. We know not where. We're looking. We're looking a little late, but we're trying. Lily stayed in West Bridgewater and was treated by Dr. Swan. She died and was buried in their cemeteries, Potter's Field, same thing. Later, probably around the time these stones were being made, Lily was given a little stone that says Lily McGuire, age 14. And that's there today. You can look and you can see the graves of the people who don't have the gravestones because there's indentations in the ground. But Lily has a stone now, and many people who know the story go there because there were very few fugitive slaves that we know of and where they're buried. The irony here is that James Swan went to a younger neighbor and said, after I pass away, would you take care of Lily's grave? And that family continues two generations down to do that every year. And what happened is one day in the 1890s, Dr. Swan came home from wherever he had been and said hi to the family maid and went up to his office and shot himself to death. So if we were following traditional burial practices, he shouldn't be buried in consecrated ground. But here he is. And I think the fact that he was so involved in helping others, both as a doctor and as a hero of the Underground Railroad, he definitely deserves to be here with the rest of his family. Anybody here, did I ask this last week, anybody here go to the University of Massachusetts?
My sister did.
Anybody go to the University of Connecticut? Yeah, there you go. So I knew I was safe on that one. Caleb Swan's daughter married Justin Morrell, who became a senator, a very influential senator, who basically was the person who wrote and got passed the Homestead Act. And the Homestead Act paid for the government, used the money that the homesteaders would pay the government to build something called land grant colleges. And despite the fact we don't have any homesteaders in Massachusetts, we do have a land-grant university, and that is the University of Massachusetts. So the Swan family, Caleb's daughter, the whole family was very politically active, contributed to the fact that many, many, many people get to go to UMass for less than it costs to go to Harvard. So cemeteries are a wonderful place to go and walk and learn the stories of the people that are there, and I hope you enjoyed today. Thank you.